"Mom, it's better if you don't come to the wedding." My son said it like he was asking me to pass the salt, calm, casual, almost polite, as if those 10 words wouldn't echo in my house long after the call ended. I didn't respond right away. I just stood there in my kitchen, my hand resting on the edge of the counter, staring at the sunlight stretching across the hardwood floor. It was a warm April morning in Connecticut, the kind of morning where everything feels new, hopeful, like life is moving forward exactly the way it should. And yet, in that moment, something inside me went very still. "All right," I said finally. My voice didn't crack. I didn't ask why. I didn't beg for an explanation. There was a pause on the other end of the line, like he had expected more from me. Maybe tears, maybe resistance, maybe a scene he could hang up on. But I gave him nothing. "It's just complicated," Daniel added, his tone softer now, almost relieved. "Emily thinks it would be better. Less stress. You know how weddings are." Yes, I knew exactly how weddings were. I had planned one myself, 38 years ago, when I married his father. I remembered every detail of that day, from the scent of the white roses to the way my hands trembled when I said my vows. I remembered holding Daniel as a baby, whispering promises into his tiny ear about the life I would build for him, the love I would always give him. I remembered all of it. But I didn't say any of that. "Of course," I replied. "You should focus on your day." When the call ended, the house felt larger than it had that morning. Quieter. I placed my phone down carefully on the kitchen table, as if it were something fragile that might break if I moved too quickly. Then I walked upstairs. The dress was still hanging on the back of my bedroom door. Pale blue, knee-length, simple but elegant. I had bought it 2 weeks earlier, after trying on at least 6 others in a small boutique downtown. The saleswoman had smiled at me in the mirror and said, "You'll look beautiful at your son's wedding." I had believed her. I reached out and smoothed the fabric with my fingertips, feeling the softness of it, the quiet anticipation it had carried just hours ago. For a moment, I imagined the ceremony. The music, the guests turning their heads as Daniel walked down the aisle. The seat I had pictured myself in, somewhere near the front, not too close, not too far, just enough to see his face clearly. Just enough to feel like I still belonged. I let my hand fall. Then I took the dress off the hanger and folded it slowly, carefully, pressing out the small creases as if I had all the time in the world. I placed it back in the closet, between coats I no longer wore and shoes I hadn't touched in years. I closed the door. Downstairs, the clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time the way it always had, indifferent to everything that had just changed. I poured myself a cup of coffee, even though it had gone lukewarm. I sat at the table and stared at the invitation that had arrived just days before. Heavy cream cardstock, gold lettering. "Daniel Whitmore and Emily Carter request the honor of your presence." I traced the words with my eyes, stopping at the part that felt almost ironic now. Honor of your presence. I wondered when that had changed. When my presence had become something inconvenient, something optional, something to be quietly removed. I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I reached for my calendar and turned to the dates circled in soft blue ink. Wedding day. I had written a small note beside it. Arrive early. Bring gift. Smile. I stared at those words for a long time. Then, with a steady hand, I crossed them out. The pen moved smoothly across the paper, leaving a clean, decisive line. I closed the calendar. The silence in the house wasn't empty. It was full of something else now. Something sharper. Clearer. I finished my coffee in one slow sip and stood up, already knowing what I would do next. Not today. Not in a rush. But soon. Very soon. Because if there was one thing I had learned in 68 years, it was this. When people ask you to step out of the picture, it's usually because they don't want you to see what they're really doing. And I had no intention of staying blind. The next morning, the house felt unfamiliar in a way I could not quite explain, as if something invisible had shifted overnight and left everything slightly out of place, even though nothing had physically moved, and I found myself noticing details I had ignored for years. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the wall clock, the way the sunlight came through the curtains and stopped just short of the dining table where Daniel used to sit when he still came by on Sundays. Back when he would talk about his week and ask me what I thought about things that mattered to him. And I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, holding a clean mug in my hand, trying to remember when that had stopped, when the conversations became shorter, more polite, more distant, like he was speaking to someone he felt obligated to call rather than someone he wanted to see. And I set the mug down slowly before walking toward the living room where a stack of unopened envelopes sat neatly arranged on the side table, bills, advertisements, and one thick cream envelope that looked out of place among the rest, heavier, more deliberate, and I picked it up, already knowing what it was before I even turned it over, because the return address was one I had seen before, Carter Events Planning, and I paused for just a second before opening it, sliding my finger carefully under the flap as if the contents inside might be fragile, and when I pulled the card out, I saw the same elegant gold lettering as the invitation, but this one was different. This one was not meant for guests. It was a schedule, a full timeline of the wedding day, printed clearly, organized down to the minute, and I scanned the lines without really meaning to, the ceremony time, the reception details, the seating arrangements, and then I saw it. A section labeled family seating, and I felt something tighten in my chest as my eyes moved down the list. Daniel Whitmore, Emily Carter, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, siblings, extended family, names I recognized and names I did not, and I kept reading, slower now, more carefully, until I reached the end of the list and realized what was missing, or rather, who was missing, and I read it again, just to be certain, just to make sure I had not overlooked something. But the space where my name should have been was not there at all, not even as an afterthought, not even in the second row, not even in the margins, and I let out a small breath I did not realize I had been holding, a quiet acknowledgement of something I already knew but had not yet seen written so clearly in front of me, and I placed the paper back into the envelope with the same careful motion I had used to take it out, as if handling it roughly might somehow change what it said, but it did not. Nothing about it changed, and I sat down on the edge of the couch, my hands resting loosely in my lap, thinking about how easy it must have been for them to do this, to remove me from the plan, to edit me out of the day entirely, like erasing a name from a list that no longer mattered. And I found myself going back, not just to yesterday, not just to that phone call, but further, to smaller moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. The way Emily would answer questions directed at Daniel before he had the chance to speak. The way she would gently correct him when he suggested visiting me, offering alternatives that sounded reasonable on the surface but always led somewhere else. The canceled dinners, the missed holidays, the polite excuses that stacked on top of each other until they formed something that looked almost normal if you did not examine it too closely. And I realized then that this had not happened suddenly. It had been building quietly, piece by piece, until it reached this point where my absence was not just accepted. It was planned, structured, printed in gold lettering on thick paper, and I stood up again, this time more slowly, more deliberately, and walked toward the hallway where a small wooden cabinet held documents I had not reviewed in years, things Daniel's father had once managed without question, accounts, records, papers that I had trusted were in order because he had always been careful, always thorough, and I opened the cabinet, pulling out a folder that felt heavier than I remembered, and for a moment I simply held it, feeling the weight of it in my hands, considering how many decisions had been made around me without my full awareness, how many conversations had happened in rooms I was not invited into, and I carried the folder back to the table, setting it down beside the envelope from the wedding planner. The two of them sitting there together, one representing a day I was no longer part of, the other holding pieces of a life I had not fully examined. And I opened the folder, not with urgency, not with panic, but with a quiet, steady focus that surprised even me. And as I flipped through the first few pages, I realized something simple and undeniable, something that settled into place with a clarity I had not felt in a long time. They might have decided that I did not belong at that wedding. They might have written me out of their plans, but there were still parts of this story that had not been decided yet, not by them, not without me. And for the first time since that phone call, I felt something shift inside me, not grief, not anger, but something colder, something sharper, something that did not need to be loud to be powerful, and I kept reading. I did not rush through the documents, and I did not skim them the way I might have in the past when I trusted that everything had already been handled for me. Instead, I moved slowly, page by page, letting each line settle before I turned to the next, because something told me that whatever I had missed over the years would not reveal itself all at once, and I was right. The first few pages were ordinary bank statements, account summaries, nothing that stood out on its own, But then I noticed a pattern, small transfers, consistent, deliberate, amounts that were not large enough to draw attention individually, but added up over time into something much more significant, and I leaned in slightly, reading the dates more carefully, matching them in my mind to moments I could remember, times when Daniel had mentioned financial stress, times when Emily had talked about wedding expenses, venues, catering, the kind of details that sounded overwhelming but manageable, and yet here, in black and white, was something else entirely, a quiet stream of money moving in a direction I had never approved, never even been aware of, and I turned another page, then another, and there it was again, different account numbers, different descriptions, but the same steady pattern, like someone had been drawing from a well they assumed would never run dry. And I felt that same stillness from the morning return, only now it was sharper, more defined, no longer just a feeling but a realization taking shape. And I set the papers down for a moment, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed to think clearly, to separate what I knew from what I had assumed, and I looked around the room. At the photographs on the wall, Daniel as a child, Daniel at his college graduation, Daniel standing beside me in the kitchen years ago, laughing about something I could no longer remember, and I wondered when that version of him had started to disappear, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, replaced by someone who could make decisions like this without ever considering what they meant, and I reached for my phone, hesitating only briefly before dialing a number I had not used in years. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered, steady, professional, unchanged by time, law office of Richard Halpern, and I closed my eyes for just a second, recognizing the name, remembering the man who had worked alongside my husband for decades, someone who understood not just the paperwork but the intentions behind it. This is Margaret Whitmore, I said, my voice even, controlled. I believe I need to review some documents that were set up by my husband before he passed. There was a pause, not of confusion but of recognition, as if my name still carried weight in places I had not visited in a long time. Of course, Mrs. Whitmore, he replied. We can arrange a time for you to come in. I glanced back at the papers spread across my table, at the envelope from the wedding planner, at the empty space where my name should have been, and I made a decision that felt less like a reaction and more like a correction, something that should have happened long ago. I would prefer to come in today, I said, and there was no hesitation in my voice now, no uncertainty, just a quiet certainty that whatever I was about to uncover, I would face it fully. And within the hour I was in my car, driving through streets I knew well, but had not truly noticed in years. The same coffee shop on the corner, the same bookstore with the faded sign, places that had remained consistent even as everything else had shifted. And when I arrived at the office, the building looked exactly as I remembered, understated, professional, the kind of place where important decisions were made without unnecessary noise. And as I stepped inside, I felt something settle into place within me. Not comfort, not nostalgia, but clarity. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, and moments later I was led into an office where Richard Halpern stood to meet me. Older now, his hair more silver than I remembered, but his presence unchanged, steady, attentive, and he gestured for me to sit, his expression calm but observant, as if he already understood that this was not a casual visit, and I placed the folder on his desk, opening it to the pages I had marked, sliding them toward him without explanation, because I wanted to see what he would notice, what he would say, and he adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents with a practiced eye, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly as he moved from one page to the next, not surprised, not alarmed, but focused, and after a moment he looked up at me, meeting my gaze directly. Mrs. Whitmore, he said carefully, do you know how these accounts are structured? And I shook my head once slowly. No, I replied, but I think I am about to find out. And for the first time since this began, I understood something with complete certainty. Whatever Daniel and Emily believed about my role in their lives, whatever assumptions they had made about what I would accept or overlook, they had built those assumptions on a version of me that no longer existed, and I was ready to see exactly how much they had underestimated. Richard did not answer immediately, and that was the first thing that told me this was more serious than a simple misunderstanding, because in all the years I had known him, he had never hesitated unless there was something worth measuring carefully before saying out loud. And he leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together as he looked at the documents again, then back at me, as if deciding how much I was ready to hear in one sitting. Your husband set up a trust structure. About 6 years before he passed, he said finally, his voice steady, precise. It was designed to protect the primary assets, the house, the investment accounts, and certain business interests from being accessed without your direct authorization. I listened without interrupting, letting each word settle into place, because this was not unfamiliar territory. My husband had always been meticulous about planning ahead, about making sure things were secure, even when everything seemed stable. But there was something else in Richard's tone, something that suggested there was more beneath the surface. You are listed as the primary trustee, he continued, which means nothing significant can be moved, sold, or reassigned without your approval. I felt a quiet shift inside me at that sentence. Not relief, not yet, but a recognition of something important, something that had not been taken from me the way I had begun to suspect. Then how? I asked calmly, gesturing toward the pages in front of him. Are these transactions happening? Richard nodded slightly, as if he had been expecting that question, and he turned the documents toward himself again, pointing to a series of entries I had already noticed. These are not direct withdrawals from the trust, he explained. They are transfers from secondary accounts that were set up under your name, but linked to the main structure. Accounts that require less oversight for smaller amounts. I followed his explanation carefully, the pieces beginning to connect in a way that was both clear and unsettling. So someone has been using access that was intended for convenience, I said, more to confirm my understanding than to ask, and Richard gave a small, measured nod. That would be a fair way to put it, he replied, and there was no accusation in his voice, no judgment, just a statement of fact, which somehow made it more precise, more undeniable. Who has access to those accounts? I asked, and this time there was no pause. Your son was granted limited access several years ago, he said, for emergency situations and day-to-day assistance, nothing beyond that scope. I let that settle, not as a shock, but as a confirmation of something I had already begun to understand. Daniel had not broken into anything. He had not forced his way past barriers. He had simply used what had been given to him, and perhaps extended that use further than it was ever meant to go. And I thought about the timing, the steady pattern of transfers, the growing distance, the careful way Emily had positioned herself in every conversation, and I did not feel anger, not the kind that rushes in quickly and demands to be expressed. What I felt was something quieter, something that sharpened my focus instead of clouding it. Can this be stopped? I asked, my voice even, controlled, and Richard met my gaze directly. Yes, he said, immediately, if you choose. There was something about the simplicity of that answer that made everything else fall into place. No dramatic confrontation, no complicated negotiation, just a decision, one that had been mine all along, whether I realized it or not, and I nodded once, slowly. Then I would like to review every account connected to this structure, I said, and I want full reports on all activity over the past 12 months. Richard did not hesitate this time. He simply reached for his phone, already making notes, already moving forward with a level of efficiency that matched the clarity I was beginning to feel. And as he worked, I sat there quietly, my hands resting in my lap, thinking about the difference between being excluded and being removed, because what had happened with the wedding, with that invitation, with that empty space where my name should have been, that was exclusion, something visible, something that could be explained away with polite words and careful phrasing. But this was something else. This was removal, subtle, structured, designed to happen without drawing attention, and I realized then that the two were not separate. They were connected, part of the same pattern, one emotional, the other practical, both leading to the same outcome. And for the first time since this began, I saw the full shape of it, not as a series of isolated moments, but as a deliberate shift, a repositioning that had been happening quietly over time. And I also understood something else, something even more important. I had been given a role in this structure that still held weight, still held authority, and whether they had forgotten that or simply assumed I would never use it no longer mattered, because now I knew. And once you know something like that, you cannot return to not knowing. You cannot step back into the version of yourself that allowed things to pass unnoticed. and Richard looked up again after a few minutes, his expression composed, professional. "I will have the full reports ready by tomorrow," he said, "and we can initiate any changes you decide on immediately after that." I nodded, standing slowly, feeling the steadiness in my own movements, the absence of hesitation. "Thank you," I said, and as I turned to leave, I paused just briefly, not to reconsider, not to question, but to acknowledge something simple and undeniable. They had asked me not to come to that wedding. They had assumed my absence would make things easier, cleaner, simpler, but what they had not considered was what I might do with that absence, how much space it would give me to see clearly, to act without interruption. And as I stepped out into the afternoon light, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me. I was preparing to decide what would happen next. The drive home felt different than the one I had taken just an hour earlier, not because the roads had changed or the traffic had shifted, but because I was no longer the same person sitting behind the wheel, and I noticed it in small ways. The way my hands rested more firmly on the steering wheel, the way my eyes moved more deliberately between the road and the mirrors, as if everything around me had sharpened just slightly. And when I pulled into my driveway, I did not sit in the car the way I sometimes did, lingering for a few extra minutes before going inside. Instead, I turned off the engine, stepped out, and walked straight to the front door with a quiet sense of purpose that did not need to announce itself. And inside, the house greeted me with the same stillness as before, but now it felt less like emptiness and more like space, space that belonged to me, space that had not been taken or reduced in any way, despite what had been happening around me. And I set my keys down on the table and walked back to the documents I had left earlier, the folders still open, the pages still neatly arranged, waiting for me to continue where I had left off. And this time, I did not hesitate at all. I sat down and began organizing everything, separating statements by account, arranging dates in order, marking transactions that repeated, creating a structure that allowed me to see the pattern more clearly. And as I worked, the numbers stopped being abstract. They began to tell a story, one that unfolded quietly but with unmistakable direction, and I saw how the transfers increased over time, how they aligned with certain milestones, deposits made just before large vendor payments, withdrawals, timed around what must have been planning stages for the wedding, and I realized that what I had initially thought of as scattered activity was actually coordinated, careful, designed to blend in just enough to avoid immediate attention, and I leaned back slightly, letting that realization settle, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of clarity that made everything else easier to process. And I reached for a notepad, writing down a simple list, dates, amounts, account, numbers, not because I needed to prove anything yet, but because I wanted to understand the full picture before taking the next step. And once I had that list, I turned to my phone again, scrolling through my contacts until I found Daniel's name, my thumb resting over it for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of consideration, because calling him now would change the rhythm of everything that followed. It would bring emotion into a process that was still better served by distance, and I lowered the phone without pressing the call button, placing it back on the table, choosing instead to remain exactly where I was, steady, observant, in control of what I knew and when I chose to reveal it. And I stood up, walking into the kitchen where I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, the simple act grounding me in a way that felt almost intentional. And as I stood there, watching the steam rise slowly from the mug, I thought about the timeline ahead, the wedding just days away, the final preparations likely happening at a pace that left little room for reflection on their side. And I understood something important in that moment. Timing would matter, not for the sake of drama, not for any kind of spectacle, but because timing determines whether a truth is dismissed or recognized, whether it is seen as a disruption or as a revelation. And I returned to the table, picking up the envelope from the wedding planner once more, reading through the schedule again, noting the exact times, the ceremony, the reception, the transitions between each part of the day, and I set it down beside the list I had written, the two documents now connected in a way that had not been obvious before, one outlining their expectations, the other revealing what had been happening behind those expectations. And I did not rush to any conclusions. I did not make any sudden decisions. Instead, I allowed the pieces to settle into place naturally, forming a plan that did not need to be forced, only followed. and by the time the afternoon light began to fade into early evening, I had everything arranged exactly the way I needed it, the documents organized, the key details noted, the next steps clear in my mind, and I closed the folder gently, placing it back on the table with the same care I had used before, because nothing about this required urgency anymore. Nothing required me to react in a way that would give away what I had learned, and as I turned off the kitchen light and walked toward the hallway, I felt something settle into place within me completely, a quiet certainty that did not need validation, did not need approval. It simply existed, steady and unshaken, and I realized that while they were moving forward with their plans, believing everything was under control, there was now something else in motion, something they could not see yet, something that would not interrupt them immediately, but would be there waiting at exactly the right moment. And I went to bed that night without checking my phone, without replaying the conversation from the day before, without questioning what I had already understood, because for the first time since this began, I was no longer wondering what they were doing. I knew, and more importantly, I knew what I would do next. The next day arrived quietly, without any sense of urgency pressing against it, and I woke before the alarm the way I used to when there was something important to prepare for. Except this time there was no event to attend, no schedule I needed to follow, only a series of decisions that had already been made the night before, and I moved through the house with a steady rhythm, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the early morning light settle across the same surfaces that had witnessed everything unfold over the past few days. And I did not rush, because nothing about what I was about to do required haste. It required precision, and by the time I sat down at the table with my coffee, my phone was already within reach, the folder of documents placed neatly beside it, everything aligned in a way that reflected the clarity I had reached, and at exactly 9 o'clock, I made the call, not to Daniel, not to anyone who would respond with emotion or confusion, but to Richard Halpern's office, and when his assistant answered, I spoke calmly, clearly. I would like to proceed with restricting all secondary account access effective immediately. There was a brief pause as she confirmed my identity, then a professional acknowledgement. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore, we will initiate that process right away. I thanked her and ended the call without needing further explanation, because everything that needed to be said had already been understood, and I sat there for a moment afterward, not waiting for something to happen, not expecting an immediate result, but simply recognizing that a line had just been drawn, quietly, without announcement, and once a line like that is drawn, it changes the direction of everything that follows, and I took a sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle, before reaching for the notepad I had used the previous day, adding one more line beneath the others, access revoked, and I underlined it once, not dramatically, just enough to mark it as complete, and then I closed the notepad, placing it on top of the folder, because that part was finished, and the next part did not require action. It required observation, and I stood up, moving through the house with the same calm pace, adjusting small things as I went, straightening a chair, clearing a surface, not because it was necessary, but because it grounded me, it kept everything in order, and as the hours passed, the house remained quiet, unchanged on the outside, but I knew that somewhere beyond these walls, something had already begun to shift, systems updating, permissions changing, access closing in ways that were not immediately visible, but would soon become impossible to ignore, and I did not check my phone. I did not look for confirmation, because I trusted the process I had set in motion, and it was not until early afternoon, when the sunlight had shifted slightly across the floor, that my phone finally lit up on the table, the screen displaying Daniel's name, and I looked at it for a moment before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because I already knew what this call would be about, and when I picked up, his voice was different from the day before, tighter, less controlled. Mom, did you do something with the accounts? He asked, not accusing. Not yet, but clearly unsettled, and I did not respond immediately. I let the silence sit for just a second, not to create tension, but to allow the question to fully exist before I answered it. I reviewed what needed to be reviewed, I said calmly, and there was a pause on his end, longer this time, as if he was trying to process not just my words, but the tone behind them, the absence of confusion, the absence of apology. We were in the middle of payments, he continued, his voice now carrying a hint of urgency. Things for the wedding, deposits, final balances, everything is on hold. I listened without interrupting, the details aligning exactly with what I had already seen, and when he finished, I spoke just as steadily as before. Then you should review those arrangements carefully, I said, and there was something in that sentence that shifted the conversation, something that made it clear I was no longer operating from the same position he had expected. Mom, this is not a good time for complications, he said, and I could almost picture him running a hand through his hair, pacing, trying to regain control of a situation that no longer responded the way it had before, and I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply replied, that depends on when you think this started. And the silence that followed was different from the others, not uncertain, not confused, but aware, as if for the first time, he was beginning to realize that what was happening now was not sudden, not random, but connected to something larger, something that had been building long before this moment. And I did not fill that silence for him. I let it remain, because some realizations cannot be explained. They have to be reached, and after a few seconds, he spoke again, more carefully this time. We can talk about this later, he said, after the wedding. And I considered that for a brief moment, not the words themselves, but what they implied, the assumption that things could be paused, deferred, returned to once it was convenient, and I answered with the same calm certainty that had carried me through everything so far. No, I said simply, and I did not need to add anything else, because the meaning was already clear, and when the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table, the house returning to its quiet state. But now that quiet held something else within it. Not emptiness, not waiting, but movement, slow, deliberate, already unfolding exactly as it needed to. The house remained quiet after the call ended, but the silence no longer felt neutral. It carried a subtle tension, as if something far away had shifted and the effects were beginning to ripple outward. And I moved through the afternoon with the same steady pace, not checking my phone, not turning on the television, simply allowing the time to pass while everything else unfolded exactly as it needed to. And by early evening, the second call came, this time not from Daniel, but from a number I recognized immediately, Emily, and I let it ring once before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that this conversation would be different, more direct, less restrained, and when I picked up, her voice came through sharp, controlled, but unable to fully hide the strain beneath it. Margaret, we need to talk, she said, not a greeting, not a question, just a statement that assumed urgency. And I remained seated at the table, my hand resting lightly beside the phone. We are talking, I replied, my tone even, and there was a brief pause on her end, as if she had expected resistance, or perhaps an apology, something she could respond to more easily, but I gave her neither. There is an issue with the accounts, she continued, her words carefully chosen. Payments are not going through, vendors are calling, and we are days away from the wedding. I listened without interrupting, hearing not just what she said, but how she said it, the way she framed everything as an inconvenience, a disruption to something already in motion, rather than a consequence of something that had been happening for much longer. I am aware, I said simply, and that seemed to shift her tone slightly, from controlled to more pointed. Then you also know this is not the time to make changes, she said. This affects more than just you. And I let that settle for a moment before answering, because the words themselves revealed more than she likely intended. It has never been just about me, I replied, and there was silence again, but this time it carried a different weight, not confusion, but recognition, as if she was beginning to understand that the conversation was no longer following the path she had anticipated. We can sort everything out after the wedding, she said, echoing Daniel's earlier suggestion, but with more insistence, more urgency. And I could almost picture her standing somewhere surrounded by lists, schedules, expectations, all of it suddenly less certain than it had been the day before. That would require everything to remain the same until then, I said calmly. And it will not. And for the first time, the control in her voice slipped just slightly. Margaret, this is important, she said. And I did not raise my voice. I did not interrupt. I simply responded with the same steady clarity that had carried me this far. So is everything that led to this moment. And there was no need to explain further, no need to list the transactions, the patterns, the decisions that had been made without my knowledge. Because the truth does not always need to be detailed in order to be understood. Sometimes it only needs to be acknowledged, and the quiet that followed was longer this time, stretching just enough to make the shift undeniable. And when she spoke again, her tone had changed, not softer, not kinder, but more careful. "What do you want?" she asked. And it was the first honest question she had asked since the call began, not framed as a demand, not disguised as a suggestion, just a direct acknowledgement that something had moved beyond her control. And I considered that question for a brief moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to be certain that what I said next would reflect exactly what I intended. Nothing more, nothing less. "I want everything reviewed properly," I said. "And I want it done now, not later." And there was no emotion in my voice, no edge, just a clear statement of fact. And she exhaled slowly, the sound faint but noticeable, as if she was recalibrating, adjusting to a reality that no longer aligned with her expectations. "This will cause problems," she said, and I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it. "That depends on how you define problems," I replied, and there was no argument after that. No raised voices, no attempt to push further, just a quiet understanding settling into place. And when the call ended, I set the phone down gently, the same way I had before, and I remained seated for a moment, not reflecting, not questioning, simply recognizing the shift that had just occurred, because something had changed, not just in the situation, but in the way they were beginning to see me. No longer as someone who could be managed quietly in the background, but as someone who could not be moved without consequence. And as the evening settled around the house, I stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the quiet street, the same street where Daniel had once learned to ride his bicycle, where he had fallen, gotten back up, tried again, and I realized that this moment, as complicated as it was, carried a similar kind of clarity, not about loss, not about what had already happened, but about what would happen next, because for the first time, they were no longer moving forward without me. They were reacting, adjusting, trying to understand something they had not planned for, and I had no intention of interrupting that process. I would let it unfold exactly as it needed to, because sometimes the most powerful position is not the one that acts first, but the one that waits, steady, until everything else begins to shift on its own. The following morning unfolded with a kind of quiet precision that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself had decided to slow down just enough to allow everything beneath the surface to continue shifting without interruption. And I moved through my routine with the same calm steadiness, making breakfast, opening the windows, letting the cool spring air move through the house, carrying with it a sense of clarity that had not been there before. And I did not check my phone immediately. I did not look for messages or missed calls, because I already understood that whatever needed to reach me would do so in time. And instead I returned to the table where the folder still rested, opening it once more not out of necessity, but out of confirmation, reviewing the details I had already seen, the patterns that had already revealed themselves, reinforcing the understanding that had guided every decision I had made so far. And as I turned the pages, I noticed something I had not focused on before. A series of notes attached to specific transactions, small annotations that referenced vendors, services, event planning expenses, all tied back to the same timeline, the same structure that had been carefully built around the wedding. And I traced one of the entries with my finger, reading the name of a venue coordinator, then another tied to catering, then another connected to floral arrangements. And it became clear that the scale of what had been planned extended far beyond what I had been told, far beyond what had ever been shared with me. And I leaned back slightly, allowing that realization to settle, not with surprise, but with a quiet acknowledgement of how much had been constructed without my knowledge. And I closed the folder gently, because at this point, there was nothing left to uncover, only things left to unfold. And as if in response to that thought, my phone lit up again, this time not with a call, but with a message, and I picked it up, reading the notification without urgency. It was from Richard, a brief update, confirming that all requested restrictions had been fully processed and that a complete report would be delivered electronically by the end of the day. And I set the phone down again, not needing to respond, because everything was already in motion, and I stood up, walking into the living room where the sunlight now stretched further across the floor, touching the edge of a framed photograph I had not looked at closely in years. And I picked it up, studying it for a moment. Daniel standing beside me, younger, smiling, his arm loosely around my shoulder, a moment captured from a time when everything felt simpler, when trust did not need to be examined because it was simply assumed, and I placed the photograph back exactly where it had been, not because I was holding on to it, but because I no longer needed to, and as I turned away, the sound of my phone rang again, sharper this time, more insistent, and I walked back to the table, glancing at the screen before answering. It was a number I did not recognize, but I answered anyway, because at this point, there were no surprises left, only confirmations. Mrs. Whitmore. A voice said on the other end, professional, slightly hurried. This is Claire from Carter Events Planning. I am calling regarding some payment issues we are experiencing. I listened without interrupting, already understanding the context, the connection, the exact reason for the call. Several vendors have notified us that their accounts have been placed on hold, and we are unable to proceed with final confirmations, she continued, her tone careful but clearly strained by the situation. We were told you are the primary contact for authorization, and I let a brief silence settle before responding, not to create tension, but to ensure that what I said next would be heard clearly, without distraction. That is correct, I replied, and there was a slight shift in her tone, as if she had expected resistance or confusion, but instead found clarity. We are on a very tight schedule, she said, and any delays could affect the entire event. And I considered her words, not the urgency behind them, but the structure they implied, the reliance on systems that had been quietly redirected without consideration, and I spoke with the same calm precision that had guided every step so far. Then I would suggest you pause all further actions until the accounts are reviewed, I said, and there was a pause on her end, longer this time, as if she was recalculating everything she had assumed. Pause, she repeated, not questioning, but confirming. Yes, I said simply, and there was no need to explain further, no need to justify the decision, because it was not a reaction, it was a correction, and when the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table, the house returning once again to its steady quiet. But now that quiet carried a sense of movement that was no longer distant, no longer subtle, it was present, unfolding in real time, and I walked to the window, looking out at the same street, the same passing cars, the same ordinary rhythm of a day that, on the surface, had not changed at all, and yet beneath it, everything had shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a precision that ensured nothing would remain exactly as it had been, and I stood there for a moment longer, not waiting, not anticipating, simply observing, because I understood now that what was happening did not require my constant attention, it required my awareness, my willingness to let each piece fall into place without interference, and as I turned away from the window, I felt that same steady certainty settle deeper, stronger, not as a reaction to what had been done, but as a response to what I now understood, and for the first time, I was not thinking about the wedding at all, not about the ceremony, not about the guests, not even about the absence they had planned for me, because at this point, the focus had shifted entirely. It was no longer about whether I would be there. It was about what would be left standing once everything they had built without me was forced to face the structure it had depended on all along. The day of the wedding arrived without announcement, no reminder, no message, no call to acknowledge it. And I woke at the same early hour as always, the light just beginning to touch the edges of the curtains, the house still and undisturbed. And for a moment I remained in bed, not thinking about what was happening elsewhere, not imagining the preparations, the dresses, the carefully timed schedule unfolding somewhere across town, because that part of the day no longer belonged to me, and I moved through my morning as I had the days before, making coffee, opening the windows, allowing the quiet to settle into something steady and familiar. And when I sat down at the table, the folder was still there, closed, no longer needing to be opened again, because everything it contained had already been understood, and I did not check my phone immediately. I let the morning pass at its own pace, the minutes moving forward without interruption, until eventually the first notification appeared, a message, not from Daniel, not from Emily, but from Richard, confirming that the final review had been completed and that all necessary controls remained firmly in place, and I read it once, then set the phone down again, not needing to respond, because the confirmation did not change anything. It simply affirmed what was already in motion, and as the morning continued, more messages appeared, not directed to me personally, but forwarded updates, vendor communications, inquiries redirected through the channels that had now shifted toward me, and I did not engage with them directly. I observed them, the tone, the urgency, the gradual realization, spreading through each message that something fundamental had changed, and I could almost map the timeline of the day through those messages alone. The ceremony time approaching, final confirmations failing, adjustments being attempted, each step meeting the same quiet resistance, the same absence of access that had once been assumed, and I stood at the window again, looking out at the same street, the same calm movement of an ordinary day. And I imagined, not vividly, not emotionally, but with a simple awareness, the scene unfolding elsewhere, the guests arriving, the music beginning, the expectation that everything would proceed as planned, and then the small disruptions, the delays, the quiet conversations pulled to the side, the realization that certain things could not be completed, that certain payments had not gone through, that certain confirmations were no longer valid, and I did not need to see it to understand it, because I knew how carefully everything had been structured, and how precisely that structure had now been interrupted, and sometime around what I knew would be the midpoint of the ceremony, my phone rang, the sound sharper in the quiet room, and I walked back to the table, glancing at the screen before answering. Daniel. And I let it ring once more before picking up, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted the moment to fully arrive before I stepped into it, and when I answered, there was no greeting, no attempt at formality, just his voice. Strained, controlled, but clearly under pressure. Mom, what is going on? He asked, and I did not respond immediately. I let the question exist in the space between us, because it was not a simple question, not one that could be answered with a single sentence, and when I did speak, my voice remained exactly as it had been, steady, measured. You are seeing what happens when things are not handled properly, I said. And there was a pause, not of confusion, but of recognition, as if he was beginning to connect what was happening in front of him with what had been said in motion days before. This is my wedding day, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not anger, not yet, but something closer to disbelief, as if he could not reconcile the idea that this moment, of all moments, could be affected in this way. And I listened, not to the words themselves, but to what they revealed, the expectation that this day existed outside of consequence, outside of the decisions that had led to it, and I answered with the same clarity that had guided everything so far. And everything that led to it still matters, I said, and there was silence again, longer this time, heavier, and I could hear movement in the background, voices, distant, indistinct, the sound of something continuing despite the disruption. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more controlled. We need to fix this, he said, and I considered that for a brief moment, not the urgency behind it, but the assumption within it, the idea that this was something to be corrected quickly, quietly, without fully addressing what had caused it. And I replied with a simple truth. This is not something that gets fixed in the middle of a ceremony. And the words settled between us, not as a refusal, but as a boundary, clear and unmoving. And I did not add anything further, because there was nothing else to add. And after a moment, the line went quiet, then disconnected, and I placed the phone back on the table, the house returning once again to its steady silence. But now that silence felt complete, not waiting, not anticipating, just present, and I walked back to the window, the same view, the same street, unchanged, and I realized that while they were standing in a moment they believed should have been perfect, I was standing in one that was clear, and clarity, once it arrives, does not leave, it simply remains, shaping everything that comes after. The rest of the day unfolded without any urgency on my side, and that, more than anything, seemed to define the difference between where I was and where they were, because while I moved through the afternoon with the same steady pace, making a light lunch, clearing the kitchen, letting the hours pass without interruption, I knew that somewhere else, time was no longer moving so calmly. It was tightening, compressing, turning every small delay into something that could not be ignored, and I did not need to witness it directly to understand the progression. The ceremony would have continued, because ceremonies are designed to move forward regardless of discomfort, regardless of what is happening beneath the surface. But the details, the reception, the vendors, the confirmations that rely on structure and support, those would not have held together the same way. And sometime later, when the afternoon had shifted toward early evening, my phone rang again. The same number as before, and I answered without delay this time, because there was no longer any need to wait, and Daniel's voice came through quieter now, not controlled in the way it had been earlier, but subdued, as if something had settled around him that he could not push aside. "It is not just payments," he said, and I could hear the difference immediately, the shift from urgency to realization. "They said there are authorization issues, contracts tied to accounts that are now restricted, things we cannot access." I listened, not interrupting, allowing him to say what he needed to say, because sometimes people need to hear their own words before they understand what they mean. And when he finished, I spoke with the same calm clarity. "Those structures were not created for convenience," I said. "They were created for oversight." And there was a pause, not of confusion, but of understanding beginning to take shape. "Emily said this is going to affect everything going forward," he continued, and there was something in the way he said her name, not defensive, not aligned in the way it had been before, but uncertain, as if he was no longer entirely sure where the boundaries were, and I did not respond to that directly. Because the shift was already happening, it did not need to be pointed out. "You made this decision now," he said after a moment. "You could have waited." And I considered that, not as an accusation, but as a question he had not fully formed yet, and I answered it as simply as it deserved. "I could have," I said, "but that would not have changed what was already happening." And the silence that followed was different from the others, not tense, not heavy, but reflective, as if he was finally stepping outside the moment he had been caught in and beginning to see the larger pattern. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, steadier. "We did not think it would be a problem," he said, and that sentence, more than anything else he had said, carried the weight of everything that had led to this point, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple, an assumption made quietly, repeated over time, never questioned until it could no longer hold. And I did not respond immediately. I let that sentence exist, because it deserved to be heard fully, even by him. And then I said, "That is usually how these things begin." And there was no judgment in my voice, no edge, just a statement of fact, and I could hear movement again in the background, voices, footsteps, the sound of a day that had not gone the way it was expected to. And after a moment, he asked, more carefully this time, "What happens now?" And I looked around the room, at the same quiet space that had remained unchanged while everything else had shifted, and I answered with the same steady certainty that had carried me through each step. "Now everything is reviewed properly," I said, "and decisions are made with full awareness." And there was no resistance to that, no attempt to argue or redirect, just a quiet acceptance settling into the conversation. And when the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table, not with finality, but with completion, because something had moved from assumption to understanding, and that change, once it happens, does not reverse itself. And I walked to the window again, the same street, the same evening light stretching across the pavement, and I realized that while the day had likely felt fractured and uncertain on their side, on mine it had remained exactly what it needed to be, steady, deliberate, clear. And as the sun began to lower, casting longer shadows across the yard, I understood that what had been set in motion was no longer about a single event, not about a ceremony or a reception, but about a shift that would continue beyond this day, shaping everything that followed. And I turned away from the window, the quiet of the house settling around me once more, not empty, not waiting, but complete in a way that required nothing further to be said. The evening passed without interruption, and for the first time in several days, I allowed myself to sit without reviewing documents, without considering timelines, without measuring what had already been set in motion, because there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to prepare, only the natural progression of what had already begun. And as the house settled into its familiar quiet, I turned off the lights one by one, moving through each room with the same steady rhythm, not out of habit, alone, but because it marked a kind of closure, not to the situation itself, but to the phase of reacting, of uncovering, of deciding. And when I reached the living room, I paused briefly, looking at the same photographs, the same spaces that had carried memories I no longer needed to revisit in the same way, and I realized that what had changed was not just the circumstances, but my place within them, not removed, not diminished, but redefined in a way that no longer depended on how others chose to include or exclude me. And I went to bed that night without checking my phone, without wondering if there would be another call, because whatever needed to be said next would not come from urgency. It would come from understanding, and the following morning arrived with the same calm clarity, the sunlight steady, the house unchanged, and I moved through the early hours without interruption, making coffee, opening the windows, allowing the quiet to settle again, and it was not until mid-morning that my phone rang. The sound no longer sharp or unexpected, just another part of the day, and when I looked at the screen, it was Daniel, and I answered without hesitation, because this time, there was no anticipation of conflict, only the expectation of something different, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the tension from the previous day. It was quieter, more measured, as if something had shifted not just in the situation, but in him. "Mom," he said, and there was a pause. Not because he did not know what to say, but because he was choosing how to say it. "We need to meet." And I did. Not respond immediately, not out of reluctance, but because I understood that this moment mattered, not for what it would resolve, but for what it would reveal, and I asked simply, "When?" And he answered, "Today, if you can." And there was no urgency in his tone now, no pressure, just a request, and I considered it briefly before replying, "This afternoon." And when the call ended, I set the phone down and remained still for a moment, recognizing the difference between this conversation and the ones before it, the absence of defensiveness, the absence of expectation that things could simply return to how they were, and I spent the next few hours preparing not for a confrontation, but for a conversation that would finally exist without the assumptions that had shaped everything up to this point. And when the time came, I left the house with the same calm steadiness that had guided me through each step, driving to a small cafe not far from where Daniel now lived, a place we had been 2 years ago, before everything had become more complicated. And when I arrived, he was already there, seated at a table near the window, his posture slightly forward, his hands resting on the table in a way that suggested he had been waiting for more than just a few minutes. And when I approached, he stood, not out of formality, but out of something else, something closer to respect than I had seen in a long time. And I took my seat across from him, placing my hands calmly in front of me, and, for a moment, neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence itself carried meaning, a recognition of everything that had led to this point. And when he finally spoke, his words were not defensive, not explanatory, but direct. "I did not understand how everything was set up," he said. And I listened, not interrupting, allowing him to continue. "I thought the accounts were there to use when needed. I did not think about the structure behind them," and I nodded. Slightly, not to agree, but to acknowledge that he was speaking from a place that had not been present before. "And Emily," he added, then paused, choosing his words more carefully now. "We made decisions quickly. We assumed things would continue the way they had." And there was no accusation in his tone, no attempt to shift responsibility, just a statement of what had happened, and I remained still, letting him finish, because this was not a moment to respond immediately. It was a moment to listen fully, and when he looked up at me again, there was something different in his expression, not certainty, not expectation, but awareness, and he asked quietly, "What do we do now?" And I met his gaze steadily, the same clarity that had guided me through everything still present, and I understood that this question, unlike the ones before it, was not about fixing a moment. It was about understanding a pattern, and I answered with the same calm precision that had defined every step so far. "Now we move forward with everything fully understood," I said, and I did not need to say more than that, because the meaning was already clear, not just in the words, but in everything that had happened to bring us to this point. And as we sat there, the quiet between us no longer felt uncertain. It felt settled, not resolved, not complete, but grounded in something that had not been there before. And for the first time since this began, I saw not just the consequences of what had happened, but the possibility of something different taking shape, not because it was promised, but because it was now visible. And sometimes, that is where real change begins. We did not stay at the cafe for long, because some conversations are not meant to stretch across hours. They are meant to land, to settle, and then to leave space for what comes after. And when we stood up from that table, there was no dramatic conclusion, no promises spoken out loud, just a quiet understanding that something had shifted, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to change the direction of what would follow. And as I walked out into the afternoon light, I felt the same steady calm that had carried me through the past several days. Only now it was no longer anchored in reaction or discovery. It was anchored in clarity, the kind that does not need constant reinforcement because it has already taken root. And I drove home along the same streets I had traveled before, the same familiar turns, the same quiet neighborhoods, but everything felt slightly different, not because the world had changed, but because I no longer viewed it through the same lens. And when I stepped back into the house, the silence greeted me again, steady, unchanged, but this time it felt complete, not empty, not waiting, just present. And I set my keys down on the table, moving through the rooms with a sense of ease that had not been there before, not because everything was resolved, but because everything was understood. And over the next few days, things unfolded. Without urgency, without confrontation, Daniel followed through on what he had said, contacting Richard, reviewing the structure, asking questions he had never asked before, and I did not need to oversee every step. I did not need to insert myself into every conversation, because the foundation had already been established, and when changes were made, they were made with awareness, not assumption. And Emily reached out once. A brief message, measured, careful, acknowledging the situation, without attempting to redefine it. And I read it without judgment, without the need to respond immediately, because not every moment requires a reply. Some simply require recognition. And as the days moved forward, the house remained steady, my routines unchanged, the same morning light, the same quiet afternoons, the same evenings settling gently into place. And I found myself noticing small things again. The way the wind moved through the trees outside, the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk, the rhythm of a life that had always been there, waiting to be experienced without distraction. And I no longer thought about the wedding in the way I might have before, not as a moment I had missed, not as something taken from me, but as a point in time that revealed something essential, something that could not have been seen as clearly under any other circumstances. And one afternoon, as I stood in the living room, adjusting a frame that had tilted slightly on the wall, I caught my reflection in the glass, and for a brief moment, I paused, not to examine, not to question, but simply to acknowledge. The woman looking back at me was not the same one who had stood in this house days earlier, holding a phone, hearing words that were meant to push her aside. She was steadier now, clearer, no longer defined by where she was asked to stand, but by where she chose to stand. And I straightened the frame, stepping back just enough to see it align properly. And there was something in that small action that reflected everything that had happened, not dramatic, not loud, just precise, intentional, complete. And as the light shifted across the room, settling into the quiet space once more, I understood something that did not need to be spoken, something that had revealed itself through every step of this process. Absence is not always a loss. Sometimes it is a position, a place from which you can see everything clearly, a place where decisions are not rushed, not influenced, but made with full awareness. And I turned away from the wall, walking toward the kitchen, the same steady rhythm in my steps, the same calm in my breath, knowing that whatever came next would not be shaped by what had been taken or denied, but by what had been understood. And that, more than anything else, was something no one could remove.